Anyway, I'd like to start off actually by talking about this album. It's a
Yeah,
remarkable Styx album, but I'm sure you've been told that already. You've got tracks on there like Fight of Our Lives and Coming Out of the Other Side. I mean, how much of this album was actually shaped by the pandemic?
that's a great question, Barry. In fact, what's a curiosity to us is that all but two of the songs were written prior to the pandemic.
Okay.
And when we had, we were pretty well down the road of if not demoing, then finishing at least some of the vocal parts and some of the keyboard parts anyway, and some guitar parts, even before that would be myself, Tommy Shaw, and Willie Vankovich. And when March I think it was March the 9th when we got the phone call to turn around from the airport and go home for
Yeah.
for for a few weeks. We just thought, oh, we'll pick up the album next month when this whole thing is over. And then a month went by, and then 2 months went by, and then when we got to 3 months, we went, this could be indefinite. So we better listen to where the album was at and figure out what we're going to do
Yeah.
if we're just going to shelve it until. And when we listened to it, just as you just said, we realized, wow, a lot of the lyrics really relate so succinctly with what we're going through. So there, and therefore, by extension, probably a lot of people on the planet. So we better figure out a way to finish this record. And luckily, like this medium that we're on right now, which I knew nothing about on the 1st of March of 2020, by the 1st of May of 2020, I was very familiar, as we all were, with
Yeah.
this method of communicating. So we hooked it up where I was in my studio in Toronto. I have like a full studio there. Tommy and Will, Tommy Shaw and Willie Vankovich, the producer, were in Nashville. Todd was in Austin, and along with Ricky, JY was in Chicago. We hooked everything up together, and we're able to make the album just the way you and I are speaking right now.
Yes, it is it's interesting. The pandemic has yielded a whole subgenre of albums, the lockdown album, the McCartney
Yeah.
album, the last
Yes.
McCartney album, and the last Foo Fighters album. There's quite a few of them. I think in
Yeah.
years to come, people will study those albums and how they relate to that period of time.
I think
But,
you're right.
and it brings me on to the artwork. I mean, the artwork of this is fabulous. It looks like a storm, but beyond the storm is this. I'm sure you've seen the artwork before. You see all this beautiful clear skies and something beyond there. But what's interesting is the clouds form like clock hands, and you've got
Yeah.
like people. There's like a. How does the clock face motif fit into this the whole album?
You're extremely observant. First of all,
Oh.
yes, I'm very familiar with the artwork because it's on a gigantic what is it, 60 foot by 50 foot backdrop behind our entire tour this summer. So yeah, I look at it through pretty much throughout the show if I'm not facing the audience.
Huh.
And yes, I the artist who put it together, Todd from Universal, he I think it's an amalgamation of a real photograph of some kind of vortex type hole in the snow, and then there's other elements that he's superimposed into it that are important to it. And yeah, the clock face. I'm not exactly sure how that came to be, but those people, everyone you see, is somehow related to the band on there. In fact, one of our main biographers, he got the 12 o'clock position at the very top. You'll see him with a little scribe there.
Yeah.
He's got a little, he's very, the images are very tiny on the CD. On the album cover, they're on the LP vinyl, they're much more prominent. But
Yeah.
the artist's wife is there, I think, down at the 7 o'clock position. And yeah, it's a pretty interesting cover. It's a pretty interesting image to look at. And that you can see that something beyond that hole, that's in the middle, it looks very good, very tranquil, and very a much nicer place, a much nicer environment. And I love the way that he tied that in with the overall arcing theme of the album is there's a sense of renewal after a period of great upheaval.
Yeah.
So that already was built into those ingredients were already in the cake, so to speak, when we were when the pandemic hit. And then I think fight no Our Wonderful Lives and I think Stream were the two that were written after the pandemic. And because I couldn't go to Nashville, I didn't have any part of the writing on those two songs, but they seem to succinctly summarize so much about the overall album.
Sure. I mean, this I love the idea of this something beyond the storm, so to speak. It's so would you describe this as a concept album, or would
You
you?
know, do you know something? I honestly,
It's quite a woolly phrase these days, I think.
well, pardon me.
It's quite a woolly phrase these days. I mean,
It's
depending on
it
how
is
broad your definition, anything can be a concept album.
it is a woolly phrase. That's a great way to put it. Beyond honestly, beyond I even go one album before Sergeant Pepper. Beyond from Revolver on, all my favorite records I somehow categorized as being conceptual. I
Yeah.
don't know why that is. I mean, I look at all the great progressive rock albums that came out. I mean, Close to the Edge, is that a conceptual album? Even Elton John's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. I always feel it that it's a concept because somehow those songs hang together and they put you in a mood if you're listen to the album from start to finish that is unique unto itself. And so the concept really is the what do they call that? The kind of theater of the mind that
Yeah,
begins to kind of take over, and you begin to thread together a sort of unifying theme, even though the songs are very separated. But I don't mind if people see it as a concept record. I don't think it was necessarily conceived that way, but it was a commentary on where we saw, what felt relevant and worthy of bringing up in lyric form. Those
yeah.
songs all came together around the same time. So there would be, I would say, as before, there's that theme of renewal that seems to somehow come through in each of the songs in some manner.
It's funny you're talking about the concept album. Rick Wakeman did a wonderful documentary on the concept album,
Oh,
and he went as far back as Sinatra's in the Wee Small Hours as a concept album, and even as far back as Woody Guthrie's the Dust Bowl ballads, all those 78s, all dealing with the Great Depression. So it depends, you can go quite way back with this whole idea of the concept album. I think.
Rick Wakeman is a very astute person. He really is. I mean, apart from being, probably the first major inspiration that just made me decide I wanted to be a keyboard player, that in my subpar guitar playing, he's made comments over the course of his career that have been quite prescient.
Yes.
I remember a Rick Wakeman quote, believe it or not, from back in 1990. I'm going to say it was around there, and I can't remember what the publication was, but someone was asking him about. I'm sorry, I don't know how to turn these bloody notifications off there. Go away.
Okay.
Someone was asking him about did it bother him at the time? I think this was the question. Did it bother him that there'd been such a number of members of Yes and other keyboard players in the band? And his comment back then was, he said, not at all. It doesn't bother me in the least. They're all part of what Yes is. And I see that there'll be a Yes 100 years from now, maybe 200 years.
Yeah.
And I thought, what is he talking about? And then, I just kind of bristled at that and thought, oh, no, I know the classic lineup of Yes. Don't you tell me. And, and but as he explained the thing, he said, look, Yes music, and this is 1990, this is like 32 years ago. Yes music is going to stand the test of time. It will probably be around in 100 years, and there will be people playing it, and there will be a form, much like there's a London Symphony that 200 years ago played Beethoven. There's a London Symphony today with none of those original members that are still playing Beethoven, and they are pretty much the authoritative voice on that. And I thought, I wonder if that will actually unfold that way. And I've witnessed it over the course of all these years. I'm like, my God, that he had it right. That's really what has happened. Is I was looking at the Rolling Stones a couple of years ago. I saw them, and I'm looking at Ron Wood, and I'm thinking, oh my God, he's the third guitarist in this band. He's the third guy in that role, and yet he's every bit as much a Rolling Stone as Brian Jones, to my mind, especially live. And so Rick Wakeman, yeah, he's a pretty clever fellow.
Well, it's interesting. I think there was some critic that said Yes is basically Chris Squire and whoever else turns up. So I don't know.
Well, I made a solo record with John Anderson prior to me joining Styx in 1987. We did a record together, and so I got to chat with him about Yes a little bit. And there's always, any great band seems to have a sort of yin and yang pull to it, and I
Yeah,
think the center of what Yes is, or you know what it is. I'll speak in the present term, is John Anderson and Chris Squire. Although he's not with us, he's still part. He'll always be part of it.
yeah,
And the pull between the two of them as to which way the band should go, and then these other three incredible musicians that kind of interpret that and pull it in one direction or another, with a chief writer being Steve Howe. So yeah, there's always that core element, but then there's the other people that come in and kind of extend that spirit.
yeah, yeah. But you've actually very much touched upon a question I was going to ask you anyway. Was how big an influence were the likes of Rick Wakeman, Tony Banks, and Keith Emerson?
You mentioned three of my faves. I
Uh-huh.
would say those three would be at the top. I think Tony Banks uh, might be, if I look at my overall career, I think he's the most influential, I
Yeah,
guess, in my own, because he's more connected to songwriting in a lot of ways than Rick Wakeman, and Keith Emerson. The technical proficiency of those players definitely made me want to go to the Royal Conservatory, for example,
sure,
and go
sure.
to classical music, etc. And their playing ability is so, well, it's the top level of the top. Tony Banks, I think, because of the band setup of Genesis, was very much invested in songwriting, and that basically took more of a guiding path for me in the overall scheme of things.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. We touch upon progressive rock, but how much did the emerging punk and new wave scene shape your musical journey?
Great. First of all, yeah, there's another layer of keyboard players, piano players, predominantly Nicky Hopkins, Freddie Mercury, Elton John,
Yeah, yeah,
Billy Preston.
yeah,
Those
yeah.
guys were very much an influence of me wanting to basically get to the piano more than any other keyboard.
Mhm.
So there's that layer. As far as when punk came in, it's funny. I had a friend of mine also. I was originally born in I was born in Glasgow, Scotland, and we emigrated to Canada. Um, but I had another Scottish friend named Kenny McLean who was a real proponent of like the Sex Pistols and the Clash and the early punk bands that came out. And in 19, I'll say, I think it was roughly 77 or 78. I think around 78. I was so invested in progressive rock that I didn't really understand punk at first.
Uh-huh.
And one day when I went over to his place one time. He said, "Just let me put the record on and see what you think." And it was Anarchy in the UK, and listening to the first side and thinking, well, first of all, there's no keyboards in this, and it's kind of like, yeah, they're kind of yelling a lot. And by the second side, something happened. I just realized, wait a minute, this sounds like fun. This is amazing. I'm kind of digging this. Kenny was cutting my hair at the time, and I'm really noticing, yeah, maybe the fun factor has to be in music as well. That's part of what rock is, and the danger in progressive rock, which is my favorite form, is the fun factor can get filtered out if you're not careful, and so that became part of my. That was in the little checklist of things that to me make up a really great song. Is there still has to be an element of playfulness and fun in there, even if it can be the most serious of subjects.
Yeah.
I would say that's very evident in a song like, say, Bohemian Rhapsody, which is extremely progressive in its own way. But the fun factor is right up there, along with the musicianship and the inventiveness of it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's
Oh, and I'm going to say one more thing.
go
One
on.
more thing about that. I got to do a tour in the UK just before I joined Styx, where I opened for the Stranglers,
Oh
and
wow.
Dave Greenfield, right, was the
Yeah,
keyboard
you
player.
passed away recently.
I realized that, and I'm so sad to hear that, because he was one of maybe my favorite keyboard player of that era. Although it's hard for me to really categorize the Stranglers as a punk band. I know they emerged at that time, but when I listened to their songs when we toured together, we did like 27 dates throughout the UK. His keyboard parts were so clever and still had that fun factor was in there, but also the great musicianship and playfulness was woven into the fabric of their songs.
Yeah, I saw the classic lineup of the Stranglers many years ago. That's when Hugh Cornwall was singing with them. So I
Yeah,
don't.
I never met him. Yeah,
Yeah, a great band. Back to
yeah,
this wonderful album, Lost at Sea. I read some of it's been described as an aquatic fever dream. What was the inspiration
yeah.
for that song? And did you, in the back of your mind, have "Come Sail Away" at the back of your mind when you were writing that one? This nautical idea.
Quite probably because I've sung "Come Sail Away" now over the past 23 years, probably a few thousand times in front of gigantic audiences, just as like we did last night. We will again tonight. And so there's something of that in there. However, on our previous album, there was a piece of music I did called Key Dive, Khedive.
Hmm.
That was the name of the ship that my dad served on in the Royal Navy in the Second World War. And it
Right.
was also that the mission is a concept album about a mission to Mars,
Sure.
and that's the name of the capsule they called it of the space capsule was Key Dive. We decided to use that, and between that album and this one, I think where Lost at Sea really came from is that my dad moved on to the next plane of existence. I don't
Yeah.
like to say he died because I think of him all the time.
Mhm.
And I think that was part of it. Was I was a little bit metaphorically speaking, lost at sea. He'd been a sailor, and I somehow that had never been part of my life, but yet kind of metaphorically I was. Now in the shows
Yeah.
we do Lost at Sea. Chuck Panazzo and myself do Lost at Sea, and it segues straight into Come Sail Away. So yeah, they are connected, particularly in the live show.
Oh, brilliant. I was interesting. I was reading a biography of Brian Wilson recently, and he said that God Only Knows was so easy to write. It was like walking through butter or something, he said. And Tommy
Yeah.
Shaw has also said the writing Crash the Crown. It also came so easily. Does writing usually come so easily for you guys, or is it something that is can be quite difficult?
Well, honestly, I struggle with it. It's the hardest part and the most rewarding part, quite frankly, when you get it right, or when you believe you got it right,
Uh,
or when other people tell you you got it right.
yeah, yeah,
um, I'd say that what I love about being in a band and being in Styx is that in the writing process, the most unusual and most unexpected things happen. So take, for example, the title track "Crash of the Crown." There are three lead vocalists on it. It starts with JY, and then kind of Tommy kind of takes over, and then I take over the end part of the song. And the sorry about that. The idea of two or three musical ideas clashing together and yet comprising one piece of music that still stands and makes sense, from beginning to end. That's the surprise factor. I find it can be kind of arduous getting there, but once it's there, the euphoria of it when you're in the room with the other guys, you go, "Oh my God, that was so easy."
yeah,
So
yeah,
you kind of default to it was easy, but when you think about it, it probably takes about a week to get there.
yeah. Do you find writing for Styx very different to, say, writing a song maybe for a solo album or something? Is it a different
Very
process?
different. Very
Yeah.
different. Well, because most of when you're writing for Styx, it's a lot of fragments have to be kind of kept in mind. And the great thing about these phones now is that you can keep a lot of ideas kind
Yeah.
of indexed, and you suddenly realize, oh, this piece of music is going this way. That idea from last year or 2 months ago or yesterday might be the next piece of the puzzle of piecing this together. Whereas writing on your own, you really that can be that's a completely different exercise. You're trying to finish a completed piece of music with lyrics that all hang intact, and you don't necessarily have to consider the other guys in the band and what they're going to be doing, what's going to make it interesting to them. They can figure that out once we get there. But when you're writing with a band, it's like everyone wants to feel that they're invested in some way in their corner of the their perspective on it, you know.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, this album actually has a very vintage rock prog sound. I mean, was
Yeah,
that intentional or did it just turn out that way?
100% intentional. First of all, it's recorded analog. You know, I've got the big 2-inch machines at home at our studio in Toronto, and so we recorded to tape. We really use, other than the editing, we use we record to tape, and we use old clunky old machines that fortunately there are guys in Nashville that still know how to keep them running. We kind of more or less pretend it's 1979. You
Uh-huh.
know, like we don't go beyond there, and try to sonically match them up with the classic albums of that era, whether they be Styx albums or any other great record of that era, so that you don't feel this sudden bump where the digital world takes over and you've got a completely different paradigm of how the whole thing sounds.
Yeah.
Um, and the reason that we've really pushed ourselves in that direction, Barry, is that um, by around, let's say, roughly 2010, 2012, you began to realize there's so many younger people, and now it's like half the audience on any night can be under 40, so they weren't even born when the biggest classic rock records are made, and yet those records are concurrent with the way they listen to music, and it's I don't think you could even need to argue that classic rock or rock music in general was the great musical statement of the last half of the 20th century, much the same as say jazz was in the first half of the 20th century. So it's completely stood the test of time. It's found new listeners that relate to it and absorb it to the same degree that we did growing up with it. And so we want to make records that stay within those, we'll call them boundaries, but I don't mean that. I mean that kind of sonic way of doing it, almost the way that you would still write for a symphony orchestra. You're still going to write parts that fit with all those instruments and fit with that overall idea, and not, so we try to minimize things like, things that are in modern songs that you hear that some of which are great, but the greatest ones to our ears are the ones that
Yeah.
sound most like they are influenced by classic rock.
Yeah. The track Monster, I mean, I'm wondering what keyboard you use on that. From a layman's perspective,
Yeah,
it sounds a bit moogish. I'm just
yeah, very
wondering,
much. It's
is
it's an it's an Oberheim 2-voice Oberheim, which is a classic instrument of the Moog era. It's funny because I use the Moog stuff more on my solo stuff and use the Oberheim stuff on the Styx stuff because it ties in with their earlier records. There's on Monster. There's B3 organ, right? We've got a 1950s B3, Hammond B3, and yeah, it's mostly that Oberheim 2-voice. And I'm trying to think if there was a third keyboard. There might be a tiny bit of my Mellotron in there. I have an original Mellotron from 1971.
that's fantastic. They're very temperamental, aren't they, Mellotrons?
Here's the thing: they're so temperamental. I wouldn't dare move the thing 5 inches, and I have it in the studio in Toronto, thinking it's really too bad that this will never make it onto a Styx record because I'm not moving it to Nashville, etc., and where we made the last couple of records, predominantly. And but because of the pandemic, I had to record a ton of the keyboard parts in Toronto. So the Mellotron and all those vintage keyboards I have made it onto this album, and that's part of what you're hearing is that they're authentic to that era. I have my Oberheim is from a synthesizer that I have in Toronto is from 19, I guess around 80, I think 1980 and OB8, 80 or 81. So it's right from that era and it's very authentic. But again, they're incredibly temperamental. And so you don't dare move them 3 inches or five.
I just love the Mellotron, and
And
I
me
mean,
too.
what would Strawberry Fields be without that Mellotron? It just
It's so it's such a part of that whole era and the idea of it's a completely misappropriated use of it in rock. It was intended as a pub instrument where you could have instead of having a piano, and then you could have a whole orchestra if somebody knows how to play these few keys. You've got strings and brass and all these things. The early 1950s, and it was sitting in some studios, and the Beatles and I think the Pretty Things and they just began kind of using it. And
Voodoo
then
Blues, of course, were big users of the Mellotron and King Crimson.
well, for the Crimson use of it, I think is probably the ultimate. That and the
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
I'm kind of interested. What was your first concert with Styx? What was that like for you? Must have been nerve-wracking.
Well, funny enough, I wouldn't call it that. I wouldn't say it was nerve-wracking. It was definitely. Is there a difference between nerve-wracking and daunting?
Well,
Maybe.
I don't know really. It must certainly
Yeah,
must.
I guess I'll have to look it up.
Yeah.
Um, it was like this. I opened a show for them in Montreal. They built this new arena in Montreal in 1997, and its inaugural concert, or at least one in the first month, was Styx. And the promoter, I normally played my solo shows there. Same promoter had me on the same night and said, "I'd like you to open for Styx at this new Montreal Forum." I had never seen them live, and so I opened the show. I was just solo myself on piano, and they took note of it because the audience knew my songs, and I saw them play, and I had one of the weirdest experiences at a concert ever. I really enjoyed them, and I thought, I'll never be in a band. I was solo, or I did like 6 solo albums at that point, and I thought I'll never be in a band. But it's funny. I feel like I would fit into this band. I just had that thought, and I said it to 2 people that were with me. And 2 years later, and there's a nice little story in the interim year there. But 2 years later, they called and said, we'd like you to join the band. And I felt like, oh, I think they might have called the right guy. I think I might be the right person for this, considering all the factors. And when we got together and sang, just to see if we could do that classic Styx 3-part harmony and make that kind of work, we realized right there, this kind of work, it works for us anyway. Whether it'll work for an audience or not remains to be seen. So that first concert, which was in Branson, Missouri, it was when I remember drawing breath going into Grand Illusion and realizing in that very moment, looking at a few thousand people, oh, this will be the first time they're hearing somebody else sing this song, and these are diehard Styx fans,
Yeah.
So I just basically sang it related to the lyrics as I would interpret the song. And by the end of it, the audience seemed to be pretty happy about it. And there were high fives and all that sort of thing. And so that feeling of, intrepid doom or whatever you want to call it, that kind of went away in about 3 minutes. I realized, I'd seen it work for other bands, Barry. That's the thing. I'd seen, for example, I'd had the experience in my life where when Peter Gabriel left Genesis, I thought, well, I'm going to follow Peter Gabriel. I don't even know the other 4 guys' names at that point. and then when a friend of mine told me, oh, their drummer is going to be the singer on their new album, which was Trick of the Tail. And then my buddy, he had an extra ticket to see them in Toronto, which is where I live. And I was so reluctant to go. But I can tell you, by the end of that concert, I was so conflicted. I'm thinking, well, first of all, this guy, Phil Collins, oh my God, he sings the songs fantastically, and he's the drummer. And it made me think, oh, I wonder what part was, other than the theatrics, what did Peter Gabriel do for the band? Well, I found out the following year when his first solo record came out, and I realized, oh, this is great. The whole Peter Gabriel solo albums, would they ever have even happened had he stayed in that band? And I found that I had 2 favorite acts.
Oh.
And so with that as in mind, I thought, if I can make that leap, maybe there's enough people out there that can also do the same, even though there's, it's very ingrained when there's a set lineup in a band. It's inevitable, as we talked earlier with what Rick Wakeman said, it's inevitable that life will step in and these changes will come along. So fortunately, that's so long ago now that the main thing is this: I just want to deliver the songs, the ones that I have written on, and the ones that precede me, my joining the band. I just want to do them as honestly and as authentically as I can relate to the lyrics of those songs and integrate myself into the band and see how that goes. And it's gone well.
Yeah, well, my brother and I saw Styx in 2002, at the Hammersmith Odeon in London, and
Oh, great.
we thoroughly enjoyed the show. My brother was he's a hardcore Styx fan. We just
Okay.
loved it. We didn't even think about the personnel at all, really. But
Oh,
uh,
fab.
out of interest, I mean, you've started putting Mr. Roboto in the set list. I mean, have the band
Yeah.
warmed to that album?
Say that again, the last part.
Have the band warmed to that
Oh,
album?
so here's something that I can kind of reveal when people look at the backstage drama of
Yeah,
Styx. But you know, being around these guys for so long, I wasn't there at that time. But what the problem they had with that album was not the album, and it
yeah,
was not the concept, or it wasn't the even the song Mr. Roboto. That's been misinterpreted over the years by the truth of it is from the perspective of Tommy Shaw, James Young, and Chuck, or the truth as I interpret it, is that the bad experience they had on that tour, they
yeah.
were really at the top of the world, and that tour seemed to derail it in some way because they were so adamant on getting that concept through to people. And this is the danger with concept records, as we know, it can be that it made the whole experience of that year, it soured them on it. After it being so successful, they felt this huge bump in the road, so to speak, and it they'd been together for a number of years at that point, and the personalities began to clash, and so it all happened around that album. But they were never once were they disparaging of that as a record.
Okay.
So when enough time had gone by, I remember I started bringing it up around 2011 or 2012 that we really should play this song. It's part of your history. It's stood the test of time. It's gone from being considered a kitschy song or whatever you want to think about it at the time, or an attempt for them to bridge themselves into the 80s, or whatever you want to think about it. It stood the test of time, which is the ultimate test. It's still relevant. It's a great subject matter to sing about. And when I began kind of working on it myself, I thought this really is, when you're inside it, you go, this is a great song and we should do it. And so when we were touring with Joan Jett, we thought we'll do something. We need to do something different that people aren't expecting. So Mr. Roboto got dusted off and a little bit of oil put into the gears, and it's worked out really well. We've played it every night ever since.
Oh, great. I mean, um, the one question I've got to ask you. I'm not sure whether you'll be able to answer it or not. Is that I always feel those Styx albums desperately need some sort of sonic overhaul. I mean, there seems to be a tendency these days to remaster, remix, and reissue things as
Yeah,
deluxe. I wonder if there's
yeah.
anything afoot or in about doing that with the Styx back catalogue. I wonder if you would know anything about that.
I think there's been a little bit done. I know that there was an Atmos mix, which is a new version of the surround sound of Renegade that was done recently. It sounds tremendous. There's one of the issues is that I believe, because they were on A&M Records, that some of the masters have been lost or destroyed. There was a huge fire at
Gosh.
one of the storage places. So that is a tragic thing. However, there were dubs that were found, in various parts of the country. So I think it's a strong possibility. Yeah, I think it would be fantastic, say, if Steve Wilson or someone like that, took one of those records and remastered it and remixed it or whatever. Um, it goes through. I think, they haven't gone through, say, the full remastering and remixing that the Genesis records have gone through, for example, or some of the
Yeah.
Queen stuff. So it would be great if that were to happen. I don't know the ins and outs of it though.
I think you'd have to drag Stephen Wilson away from Jethro Tull at the moment. He's doing all their remasters.
Is that what he's doing at the moment?
Yeah, and he's doing a fantastic.
Wow.
Here's a big question for you. Which of these albums do you think are the most important in the history of popular music? The Elvis debut, Pet Sounds, Sergeant Pepper, or Dark Side of the Moon?
Well, for me, it's Sergeant. What a terrible question. I mean, talk
They're
about
all
put me
fantastic, aren't they? They're all fantastic.
talk about put me on the spot. I, I've been in Sun Studios, and so I
Wow.
have thought about the momentous shift in music that happened one day there. And I've dug into some of the history of how that emerged.
Yeah.
And I just saw the Elvis movie, so
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
really I'm very glued to that at the moment. But I'm going to relate it to my own life and say that Um, in my own life, Sergeant Pepper is, to me, it's the Wizard of Oz moment where the world went from Dorothy's world went from black and white to color.
Yeah, absolutely,
So
absolutely.
that's why I can only relate it personally. Now, Dark Side of the Moon, Pet Sounds, and the Elvis. You're talking about the Elvis debut
Yeah,
album,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So all momentously important and albums that I absolutely love. I have all of most of maybe 5 tracks from that Elvis album on 78s RPMs, and I
Yeah.
played them
Wow.
on. I have a
They're
jukebox.
worth a lot of money, those, I think now.
Yeah, they are. They are, but I don't care about that. I love it because I have a 40s jukebox that I play
Uh,
them on. So
You're a guy
that's
that's worth burgling, then, I think.
probably, yeah. Let me give you the address for anyone around the world who's watching this.
That's
I'll
right.
just give you my phone number. Let me know when you're coming.
Okay.
Um, and yeah, when you listen to something like that on an old, it's like a time machine now, quite honestly. You really are hearing exactly how that affected people at the time, I suppose, or what a seismic shift it was. But in my own life, I think I was about 10, maybe 11 years old, going on 11 when Sergeant Pepper came out. And that, if I had one album, let's do the Desert Island thing. If I had
Yeah.
one album, I think I could listen to that one forever.
Oh, yeah. I mean, speaking of Elvis, of course, I'm reminded of quite an interesting quote by James Brown, who said Elvis Presley was just a hillbilly that found the blues. I thought was quite an interesting quote.
No, not completely inaccurate, but there's way, way, way more to him than that. Way
Yeah,
more. I
absolutely,
think
absolutely.
I'd encourage people to see this movie that's come out about him. It's really it highlights a lot of the things that I think have been. Have you seen it?
No, no, not yet.
I think you would, if you're an Elvis fan, I think you would, and if you're not, I think you would dig it. You begin to see that he embodies it's the crossroads of music that it was gospel, blues, country,
Mhm.
and I guess probably the beginnings of R&B. Let's call it that. Those the clash of those elements
Yeah,
really make what he embodies that he'd had that experience. It's weird. It's like I've gone to like where he was born, like the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
back in Tupelo, and I've gone to Graceland about 3, 4
yeah,
times. You begin to see that rock music, it needed someone to kind of light the fuse, and
yeah,
you know, he was so influenced by all the black culture that he grew up around, had infused into him, and he suddenly had found a way to
yeah. I mean,
release it.
those Sun records are absolutely fantastic. I listen to those. I just feel so sad that the guy had to start making these movies. Should
Yeah,
just playing this music. But
it's some tragic little thing steps into every musician's life. And
yes,
he really was a pure musician, quite frankly. Prior to getting his career getting derailed with going into the army, and then yeah, the movie career, yeah, kind of sidelined him. But look, the musician came through eventually, because when he did that '68 special,
uh,
that's where he regained all of that musicality that was overlooked, and that had been somehow fallen by the wayside because of the movies. And he regained that, and then it slipped away again, I suppose, to some degree.
yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. When you look at by about 1960, rock and roll was in crisis. I think because you had Little Richard had found God,
Yeah,
Elvis was in the army,
yeah,
Jerry Lee Lewis was scandalized,
yeah.
Chuck Berry was in prison. It was like the ground was being primed for the Beatles invasion. Really, but it was
It
certainly
what
crisis.
I love discussing that whole era, because it, it's one of those things. It kind of happened again in the punk era. Let's put it that
Yeah.
way,
Oh yeah.
where people try to put the cap back on the genie bottle, and this music is too dangerous for people to hear. This, and they do it today with rap music, and they tried to basically undermine it in so many ways, the ways that you just mentioned. And yet music, it can't be held back. It's going to find its course. It's like water. it finds the lowest ground and just flows, and it will reach people. So I find that amazing that rock music has done that to such a degree, and I see it in people's eyes every night. I see it in their faces, their whole demeanor. It's such, and after the pandemic, you realize what a vital force it is in our lives, and how connected we are to it, and how it enriches our lives to such a great degree. So, we're trying to make good records.
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful live albums I've ever heard actually is well, the Who live at Leeds is probably my favorite, but one of the most
Yeah,
powerful live albums ever, I think, is the Jerry Lee Lewis at the Star Club in Hamburg, 1964. What a absolutely fantastic
yeah.
album that is! It really is. I don't even know if it's available anymore, to be honest with you. I only have
No,
one. Go on. Sorry.
I played on stage with Jerry Lee Lewis one night in
Wow.
Toronto. Yeah, in 1995, there was a
Was that intimidating at all? He strikes me as an
yeah,
intimidating
of course it
character.
was. Of course it was.
uh,
At the same time, it was great because we had the band there as well. So Garth Hudson was there, and so it was a big rock and roll kind of a revival-y thing for a birthday for Ronnie Hawkins. Anyway, it was Jerry Lee Lewis and Carl Perkins and Jeff Healey. It was a good pal of mine being from Toronto, and the band. So there was a lot of intimidation on that stage that night. You can look it up if you like, Barry. It was called um, shit. It's Ronnie Hawkins. If you remember that name, rock and roll, the Rock and Roll All Stars or something like that they called it, and it's pretty good. I got to do a Little Richard number in that show.
wow. Well,
Yeah,
fantastic. I've only got one more question for you.
yeah.
Gene Simmons says rock is dead. To what extent would you agree with him?
I think he was probably quoting about 1,000 other people that have said that over the years. I, uh, I is it? I would argue the opposite of that. I think that too many younger people have embraced it now, and some of whom are know their rock history better than I do, and we grew up in that era. So I don't think it's possible. Like I say, it's the great musical statement of the last half of the 20th century. You could say classical music is dead, and yet it's all around the world still being played right now. There are
Yeah.
symphonies being played by orchestras everywhere. I think, despite all the efforts to kill it, I don't think it ever died. So I
Yeah.
disagree with Gene, but I
Okay.
agree with him on a lot of makeup tips.
Absolutely. Anyway, it's been wonderful chatting with you. I hope you enjoy your show later on. Does anything from does Pieces of Eight ever make it into your set these days?
It does. Yeah, we do. Well, yeah, Pieces of Eight is in the set when it'll be in the set probably next month
Uh-huh.
because we do a tour of Canada and it's a longer show. This tour we've got three bands on the bill: Loverboy, REO Speedwagon, and ourselves and
Yeah.
Styx. And so our set is we don't do Pieces of Eight. From that album though, we do Renegade and we do
Blue collar isn't Blue Collar Man from that one?
Blue Collar Man. Yeah, we do those
Yeah.
two. So we touch on each. All the Styx shows have Blue Collar Man, Renegade, Come Sail Away, Grand Illusion, Fooling Yourself, Too Much Time on Hands. Those are in every show,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
the rest is kind of it weaves around those core songs.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll try and catch you next time you come to the UK. I'd like to do that.
Perfect.
Anyway, thank you so much for speaking to me, speaking to this channel, and I
Yeah,
wish you best of luck and great luck with the show, of course, later on. And have a great day.
it was a pleasure chatting with you, Barry, and all the best. And thanks for letting people know about Crash of the Crown. And we will hopefully see you in England there as soon as possible.
You can count on it.
When the lineups die down a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Bye bye.
All right, Barry. Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye.